Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining this afternoon's event. I'm very happy that we get to start exactly on time, so thank you for being punctual. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Carrie Filippetti. I'm the Executive Director of the Vandenberg Coalition, and I am so thrilled and honored that today we have both a personal friend of mine as well as a leading national security expert, Dan Runde, who currently serves as the Senior Vice President at CSIS and has a very impressive bio, including holding senior roles at the International Finance Corporation, USAID, and others. Of most interest today, though, is that earlier this year, as many of us know, Dan came out with a phenomenal new book called The American Imperative: Reclaiming Global Leadership Through Soft Power. Now, there have been a lot of very important books in the grand strategy field over the last year or so, many of whom I'm grateful we've been able to feature here at the Vandenberg Coalition. But Dan's book is really unique in its emphasis on the role of soft power, including development tools in an era of great power conflict. So I'm very thrilled to speak with Dan today. I think this is such an underappreciated and under-discussed topic. As per usual, I'll start with a few questions and then we'll turn over to an audience Q&A shortly. So if you're interested in asking any questions, please feel free to start typing those into the box right now, and we'll get to those as we move forward in the conversation. So first, Dan, thank you so much for being here. I'm thrilled to have this chance to chat with you.
Thanks a lot, Carrie. I am so grateful. And congratulations on what a great organization is the Vandenberg Coalition. I'm thrilled to be associated with it. And I just think you're going from strength to strength. And I so appreciate you hosting this conversation with me.
Well, you know, Dan, you and I had a very, very early pre-Vandenberg conversation about sort of exactly what we've started to build here, as well as, frankly, what you've written about in the book. So I want to start with kind of broad strokes. In your book, you very deliberately frame development as one of three co-equal tools of American power alongside defense and diplomacy. That really challenges other models that put development work at a kind of lower tier of importance. So to start out, why do you think it is that foreign policy practitioners tend to undervalue development as a tool, even while lauding the importance of soft power in a foreign policy context?
So what I have found is that oftentimes the biggest supporters of global development are military folks who've served in really tough places. Jim Mattis was famous for saying, if you don't fund the State Department and USAID, then you got to buy me more bullets. And so I think I'm not I think that I also think that a lot of Republicans, and I self-identify as a Republican, I think many Republicans have a strong bias towards what we might describe as hard power, and that the soft power stuff kind of sounds wimpy, I guess, is I think part of it. I think we have a branding problem on soft power. I think development has a little bit of a reputation of being kind of hippie people with love beads and sandals. There's a little bit of that too. And I also think a lot of the folks in the aid community sometimes are kind of two minds. They want to be a part of the foreign policy conversation, and other times they're like, well, we want to be often separate and apart. We're not really part of foreign policy. So there's some problems, and there's also technocratic gobbledygook language that makes we don't often tie what the aid work is doing to actually long-term strategic goals of the United States, or we do a poor job of doing. The aid community, I think, sometimes does that, partially because it's a lot of technical experts who go really deep and then can't kind of tie it back to larger relevant national security and foreign policy interests in the United States. So I would say that the Bush 43 administration, in one of its national security strategies, I think the first one after 9/11, elevated development to a much higher level of importance. And if you looked at the Bush 43 administration, there were major investments in foreign assistance because of national security urgencies and foreign policy urgencies. There were intelligence briefings in the late 90s saying that Colombia was on its way to becoming a full-on narco state, and that the FARC and other kind of drug lords were at the gates of Bogota, and they could take over and win militarily and take it over. And so that led Republicans in the House and the Senate in the late 90s and the Clinton administration to make a 20-year commitment to what was then called Plan Colombia and later Peace Colombia. So Colombia today has problems. So if you follow Colombia, you'll say, well, yeah, it's had some really good experience. And then the last year or so, they voted some crazy person in. But if you take the long arc of the country of Colombia, it's in a much better place, albeit with some problems than it was 20 years ago. And the reason it's in a much better place is some of it is the investment of the United States in diplomacy and development. Some of it was military and intelligence assets to strengthen the Colombian military so they could beat the FARC and force the FARC to negotiate. But you needed the soft stuff to kind of go along with the hard stuff to make it work. If you look at in HIV/AIDS, there were intelligence analyses in the late 90s and early 2000s that said that there were a number of African countries that were going to become failed states. There were going to be an entire generation of orphans, and that was going to create gangs and all sorts of other kinds of bad things, whether it's forced migration of people or other things, if we didn't get a handle on the HIV/AIDS problem. Now, there were other people who were like, we should deal with the HIV/AIDS problem, but until it was framed as a national security problem, the HIV/AIDS issue wasn't dealt with. And so we've made a 20-year commitment to bend the curve on HIV/AIDS in Africa. And so there have been a lot of benefits. A number of African countries have had a workforce that's healthy. They've been able to not have to, we've been able to kind of manage that problem. There are other problems in the world, but that's been a problem we've been able to manage. If I look at things like, today there's any number of different challenges that I think about in the Trump administration, where there were challenges presented to the Trump administration, whether it was things like, well, at first the Trump administration said, we're going to, this OPIC thing, we're going to close it down. Who needs this OPIC thing? And then somebody got a hold of intelligence that said, China's got a thing called the Belt and Road. And I bet everybody on this call knows what Belt and Road is. So you can't fight something with nothing. And so in my mind, what happened was the Trump administration decided, you know what? Our something is going to be OPIC on steroids. So we created something. I helped do this from my think tank job, come up with how you could soup up the OPIC into what's now called the Development Finance Corporation. There's some challenges with the Development Finance Corporation. If you guys have trouble sleeping at night, your listeners, you can read some of our reports at CSIS on some of the implementation challenges. But the point is that the Trump administration first was like, I'm getting out of this. Who needs this OPIC thing? And they said, oh my gosh, I'm worried about China as a global competitor, and I can't fight something with nothing. I'm going to soup up the DFC. Same with the US Exim Bank, right? Many Republicans don't like the US Exim Bank, Kerry. And the Trump administration decided, you know what? China is kicking our teeth in. And a lot of the way in which they're engaging in the world is through the China Exim Bank. And so if we didn't have a US Exim Bank to counter the China Exim Bank, we were going to be fighting with one hand tied behind our back. So that's ultimately what won the argument as to why the Trump administration supported the reauthorization of the Exim Bank. And so what I would say is in the last 10 years, the developing world is changing. It's richer, freer, and more capable, but also China is a lot more capable of filling voids we leave. And so if I haven't met anybody yet, even the Trumpiest Trump person, who has said to me, oh my gosh, I am so psyched to hand over global leadership to the Chinese Communist Party. That would be awesome. I'm super ready for that. But if we let them fill in void after void after void in a whole series of non-military fields, if we don't respond to them in a non-military way in a number of different fronts, the sum total of that will be that they get to rewrite the rules of the global system. And we're not going to like it. Your listeners won't like it. We won't like it. I won't like it. So I wrote this book to say, look, I know some people think soft power is kind of wimpy, but great power competition, everybody on this call knows what that is not going to be fought in Beijing, and great power competition is not going to be played out in Moscow. It's going to be fought out in Guatemala, in Mongolia, in Ukraine, in Tanzania, in Mali, the Pacific Island states. That's where it's going to play out. And most of it, not all of it, is going to play out in a non-military way. So I'm all for peace through strength. I'm for a bigger Navy and a strong intelligence community. But most of this competition with China is going to be in soft stuff that seems wimpy, but really important.
So you mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative, and you talk about that at some length in your book. But is it enough? I mean, you mentioned sort of repurposing into the DFC. Is it enough to repurpose the development and foreign aid tools that we already have to counter China's ambitions? Or do we need to develop our own sort of comprehensive counter program to limit Beijing's influence? How do you see us as sort of like the next step of this so that we can more adequately confront China?
Thank you. That's a really important question, Carrie. I think there's a consensus in Washington that we have a big problem with China and Russia. What I don't think we have a consensus yet in the Republican Party and in Washington is what the heck to do about it. I think many Republicans would say, yeah, I want a bigger Navy. Yeah, I want to make sure I have enough missiles to shoot, to blow up the ships if China decides it wants to do Taiwan. Yeah, I'm for giving more weapons to Taiwan so that they have a porcupine strategy. Yeah, I'm for giving weapons to Ukraine. But then other than that, it starts to kind of get a lot more vague. So the reason I wrote this book was to say, I think we need to have a consensus about what to do about this in terms of like that we've got these other things. And so my book is The American Imperative, Reclaiming Global Leadership Through Soft Power. I wrote it to begin a conversation about what that strategy looks like. I think we do need to go back to the drawing board, just like we did in the early 1960s. In the Kennedy administration, just at the time of the Marshall Plan in the late 40s. And I think we need to look at our instruments. We probably need to make some adjustments and make some fixes in terms of some of its plumbing fixes, but also we need to allocate monies to certain things. I'm not saying double the foreign aid budget willy-nilly and just give, but I think what I'm saying is there may be some targeted things where we need to make some additional investments. We probably need to make some reforms and fixes. There's something like 20 agencies that do this stuff. That's way too many. There's a whole bunch of barnacles and regulatory things that are too weird. I also think we probably there's a problem between the executive branch and the legislative branch in terms of how they work together on these issues. There's a lack of trust. And it's not just development per se of foreign assistance, though that's a piece of it. It's kind of in the center. There are these other things around it. I think some of it's about how we lead in the multilateral system. I have a chapter in there, and I know you saw that. It's also about things like using our education and training strengths in the United States. I don't talk about trade and I don't talk about public diplomacy. I don't talk about energy, but those are also things that I would also include in kind of this soft power that are really important in terms of us kind of getting this right.
You mentioned the chapter on the multilateral system, and it's impossible to talk about soft power without talking about these international bodies, the United Nations, the World Bank. Obviously, Beijing has spent a significant amount of time and resources building its influence within these institutions. How can the US reassert some level of control over these organizations that we were in many cases instrumental in both founding and also continuing to exist?
So yeah, we built the international system. The World Bank, we built it. We finance a lot of it. The UN, we built it. We finance a lot of it. The United Nations, many of your listeners will know, was the name of the alliance of victors. The good guys in World War II were called the United Nations. So the system uses English. It uses the American dollar. Most of the bureaucrats are trained in American universities. It has a lot of American DNA. What's happened though over the last 10 or 15 years is China's gotten a lot smarter. They've put a field team of junior people to grow up in the system, you know, like in a baseball system, like a field team of players. They've learned English and French, gotten master's degrees in Switzerland and France and the United States and the UK. These are very qualified people. They're also learning how to pay their dues. So in the mid 90s, I mean, I'm a Republican, as I said earlier. I think Republicans have a very funny view of the multilateral system. Some of us are worried they're going to take our guns away, or they're going to do something mean to Israel, or there's going to be some hot button social issue, or they don't pay their parking tickets. So we have kind of, on one hand, they're going to kind of infringe on our sovereignty. On the other hand, they're useless. They're sort of like, I think we kind of vacillate in the Republican Party between sort of these two extremes, or this other extreme, which is, I don't want to get a permission slip from Bangladesh if I have to defend myself and get some kind of permission slip from the UN to do national security stuff. So all of that I understand, But what I would say is for people who are skeptical about Republicans who are skeptical about the multilateral system is we built it, we own it. If we run it right and ride herd on it most of the time, it's a force multiplier for an American form of globalization. Now that's the key thing.
So I want to remind our audience that if you have any questions, you can feel free to throw them into the Q&A early so that we can be sure to ask them. I definitely have quite a few more to get to before we get there, but please do feel free to write those in. You mentioned the sort of nature of the Republican Party, and obviously there's this sort of growing populist distrust of and you alluded to it, this quote unquote globalist institutions. And you mentioned at the start of this conversation that a lot of this is a messaging battle. So how do you kind of think about squaring that circle so that people can appreciate both the value of these multilateral institutions in promoting the American agenda, as well as just the importance of development in foreign nations when everybody is now seemingly arguing for us to keep everything here in the United States?
So I think if I think about, let's use COVID as an example, and then I want to there's several other things related to this. So I would say we couldn't build a wall high enough to protect ourselves from COVID. That if somebody gets some there's going to be other funny named diseases in the future. We need to have pandemic early warning systems. So if I go in and talk to someone in the Trump administration about, I'm really worried about health system strengthening in Liberia, I think people's eyes would glaze over and say, that is the dumbest thing ever. But if I say to you, are you worried about having some sick nurse show up at Newark Airport? They say, yeah, I don't want that. So some of it's about how we talk about these things. If we use technocratic gobbledygook, then we're going to lose a lot of people who are national security people or foreign policy people, or just educated citizens or educated members of Congress who should care about this stuff. So I would argue that we're going to have other funny named diseases in the near future. So I don't wish it. I wish we didn't have to. So we need to have early warning systems to be aware of it. And then we need to have some ability to produce vaccines in a way that not just vaccinate us, but vaccinate the whole world. What you saw with COVID was China and Russia as dictatorships held back vaccines from their own people. Now, they made crap vaccines. Everybody on this call knows about their crappy vaccines. But if you have a choice and you're a third world country between a crappy vaccine and no vaccine, guess what? You're going with a crappy vaccine and you're grateful for it. So what we did was we said, hey, sorry, the top shelf stuff, that's reserved for Pittsburgh, not for Paraguay. So Paraguay, you need to wait like 6 months and we'll get to you. Well, that's like, that answer doesn't work in an age where China can say like, hey, while you're waiting on the top shelf stuff, I got some crap vaccine for you that I'll give you right now. And they'll say, oh, thank you so much. You're our friend. America's not our friend. So we have to have a better answer than saying, hey guys, can you wait 6 or 9 months and then we'll get to you while they're having people dying on the streets in Paraguay. So that's not an answer. So I think part of it is to tie it to our national security and our national interest and tie it to China. As I said earlier, I haven't had anybody yet in Washington say to me, oh my gosh, I would love it if Red China would run the world. Like, I want to hand all this burden, it's too much. Let me just give it to the Chinese. So far, I haven't found anybody, even the most MAGA person, I've not had anybody ever say to me in Washington, oh my gosh, I'm so ready for this. But my argument is that in all these kind of seemingly unrelated fields, if we let them take the lead over time, they're going to ultimately supplant in these small things. It adds up to kind of a whole. This is part of like the condo fees of global leadership. You want to be a global leader, you got to pay the condo fees. And so my argument is we got to pay the condo fees, and otherwise they will. They got the money and the capacity to do it. This isn't 1995 anymore. And so we have to be able to respond. We don't have to do everything dollar for dollar, but with our partners, and I haven't talked about our allies and partners, this isn't an America first strategy. This is one of our strengths is we've got lots of friends. Now we got to be nice to our friends. We got to get our friends to help us burden share. But if we work with our friends and we enable alternatives, sometimes it's in the vaccine space, sometimes it's in the digital space, sometimes it's in the infrastructure space. You know, we can push back. I'd rather be us than them, but we do need to have a strategy to push back.
I think the burden sharing conversation is such a critical one, and it's central to the debate that's going on right now, particularly within the Republican Party. So to draw this to a contemporary case, if and when the war in Ukraine ends, the country is obviously going to be left with a reconstruction bill in the likely hundreds of billions of dollars, if not higher. There's been a lot of talk about whether Europe should take the lead on reconstruction, since the US is already leading with military aid. In addition, in a way to kind of prevent China from using reconstruction aid to gain an additional foothold in Europe. How should the US approach reconstruction in Ukraine to advance American interests in accordance with their values, while also recognizing the critical role that our allies can and should be playing?
Thank you, Carrie. This is a really important question. Let me first go to this issue of burden sharing, and then let me turn to Ukraine. So I would argue that many of the debates in the Trump administration, I think it was often unfair of critics of the Trump administration to say the Trump administration didn't want to lead in the world, or the Trump administration wanted to go home. I think those were like really intellectually lazy critiques of the Trump administration. What I would argue is that the Trump administration wanted to renegotiate the terms of burden sharing across a number of different fields. And guess what? You're seeing some of that play out in the Biden administration. And you could argue that some of that played out in the Obama administration. So I would argue that we're in the process of attempting to continue to lead while sort of renegotiating the terms of the condo fees, of who pays the condo fees and the kind of burden sharing that we're doing. And I think that's an important conversation. And I think it was something that the Trump administration oftentimes did right in terms of pushing the others to pay more for NATO and other things like that. Some of it they got really right. Some of it not so much, but that I would argue that was what we were what the Trump administration was trying to do in many instances, was renegotiate the burden sharing while continuing to lead. Now, on the issue of Ukraine, I've been leading a major economic reconstruction commission on Ukraine. What happens in Ukraine is not going to stay in Ukraine. Putin is not going to be satisfied with little bits that are hard to, on pieces of the map we can't find of Ukraine that are hard to pronounce. He wants the whole Ukraine. He wants all of Belarus. He wants pieces of Kazakhstan. He'd like pieces or all of the 3 Baltic states. He'd like a piece of Poland. This guy is insatiable. He's not going to stop here. We want him to be defeated in Ukraine. We want him to be defeated so badly that he says he has the same reaction that the Russians have toward Finland. After the 1939 war, you haven't heard anybody in Russia say, man, I'm ready to have another war with the Finns. That would be great. That was such a bad experience for the Russians. They said, for the next 100 years, I'm not going to try and do Finland again. What we want is them to have such a bad experience in Ukraine. They say, oh man, I'm not going to try and do Ukraine again. We want them to push them back to the 1991 borders. Then what we want, so we want the Ukrainians to defeat the Russians, because if we defeat the Russians, it means a weaker Russia. A weaker Russia is a weaker China. A weaker China is less likely to think about taking on Taiwan. So if some of you are listening, like, well, why should we care about this Ukraine thing? Well, first of all, it's about we shouldn't have people going around invading countries and redrawing the maps of the world. For 80 years, we've said that's not how we do things. But second of all, if you're worried about China, and I bet most of the folks on this call are worried about China, this directly impacts Taiwan's security. And we should be pushing Taiwan to be doing a heck of a lot more in Ukraine, because Ukraine's success is Taiwan's success. But I would say ultimately what we want in Ukraine is for Ukraine 15 years from today to be a full-on member of the EU. So yeah, the Europeans need to take on a big role. I know the EU has a bad rap in town, but the European Union is like a big carrot. It's like the coolest fraternity at a college. Like, what would you do to join the coolest fraternity or sorority at college? What hazing would you put up with? So the Ukrainians, I think, are willing to do hard things to join the coolest fraternity or sorority in the world, which is the European Union. Second, we want them, I think ultimately they're probably going to have to join NATO. If they're not going to join NATO, then we need to have some kind of an agreement like we have with Israel. We don't have a treaty alliance with Israel, but we give them the top shelf weapons, and we have an ongoing kind of multi-year sustained security partnership and economic partnership. Ukraine is going to be either another Israel partnership, or it's going to be a member of NATO. And we should want that. We want them to be so strong that Russia never messes with them ever again. But we also want them to be rich, They're 1/4 they're the same size as Poland, and they're 1/4 as wealthy. That's crazy. They should be as rich as Poland. Imagine a country as rich as Poland in Ukraine, a country with the ag productivity of Canada, the tech sector of Estonia, the manufacturing heft of the Germans, and the defense industrial base of Israel. That's what we should be aiming for. And I think it's possible.
So how do we, I mean, I think one of the main criticisms of using development is that you naturally kind of run up against this issue of prioritization, because of course, you know, kind of inoculating Latin America, Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Europe against, you know, Chinese influence using development tool, the question will naturally arise of, you know, do we really have the capacity to do that? So how do you think about the sort of main priorities for us to be focused on within this space?
So what I would say is so I think we need to, I would start with the digital divide. I don't want the rest of the world to have their digital rails of the future controlled by China. So everyone on this call's heard of Huawei and ZTE. We have to enable an alternative to Huawei and ZTE so that developing countries, whether it's in Africa or Latin America, are using some digital system other than Huawei and ZTE. There's a whole bunch of bad things that are going to happen. So we got to be using our foreign aid and the Development Finance Corporation, the multilateral development institutions to deal with that. The second thing that I think doesn't get enough attention is if you're concerned about climate change, then you ought to love mining. You ought to love mining to the tips of your toes. Now, I haven't heard most people in Washington who purport to worry about climate change worry about mining. If you're worried about a fourth industrial revolution or sort of the new technologies, like we don't want to switch from Iran, Venezuela, and Saudi Arabia and being dependent on them for oil, for being full on dependent on the Chinese Communist Party for the processing of metals. But that's what our choice is now. So I think we need to get a lot more religion on mining, and we ought to be using our foreign aid and our development finance institutions to enable either the acquisition of mines, supporting mining activities, and helping countries mine without be China free of mining. And I think we ought to be, so I think there's a digital conversation. I think there's a mining conversation. I think there's everybody who sat in their basement for a year because of COVID would say, we need to have pandemic preparedness. Like we're not that great at it. We need to get our act together. So if you said to me 3 things I'd be thinking about, it's digital, minerals as the new oil, and the third would be is like, I think everyone's going to agree is like, I don't want to sit in my basement again. And so I want to figure out how I'm going to have early warning systems. And I'm also going to figure out a system for like, where we're going to have a series of small countries with robust intellectual property and capable workforce and good infrastructure to be swing producers of vaccines. So that when we say, instead of saying to Paraguay, hey, Paraguay, you get in line and we'll get to you in 9 months, so that the Chinese Communist Party comes with their crap vaccine and fills the gap while we're waiting for 9 months. We can't do that anymore. We need to be able to say, well, hey, Uruguay is producing a whole ton of vaccines and is going to get to you next month, or Panama is producing a whole ton of vaccines and they're going to get you in another month. So I'd say something on pandemics, something on digital, and something on minerals are 3 things that don't get enough attention. I'd also say, I think many developing countries want to develop gas, and I think oil as well. So the multilateral development banks, the development finance institutions, and the export credit agencies and aid agencies, they don't want anything to do with gas, they want anything to do with oil. But guess what? I don't believe any developing country is going to say, okay, Greta, you're right, I'm going to keep it in the ground. That's baloney. But there are a lot of people in Washington that seem to think, including serious policymakers, who seem to think that's the case. It's not true. So I think a Republican foreign policy and a development policy needs to revisit this stuff and say, we're going to allow MDBs and DFIs and ECAs and aid agencies, I know there's a lot of acronyms, to finance oil and gas activity in places like Africa. It's ridiculous. None of those countries are going to leave it, quote unquote, leave it in the ground. That's not true. But if you talk to a lot of people in town, you'd think, oh yeah, that's true. It's not true. So there are people, senior people in the Biden administration pushing that. I disagree with that. It's not true.
So what's really interesting about what you're proposing, you know, the Vandenberg Coalition, we were established to really try to come up with solutions that are best for the country, almost regardless of of politics, right? Whether it's Democrat or Republican, the idea of digital, mineral, and early warning or pandemic response system, these are all things that are very bipartisan in nature. So if you're advising the next president-elect, Democrat or Republican, what are the top things that you would have them sort of, like if you said day one going in there, you need to do, this one thing, what would be your number one priority for them? Is it one of these three? Is it something more
Yes,
specific?
I would stick with those first three. I would say it's minerals, digital, and pandemic preparedness. I think if we got those three things right over a 4-year term, that would be amazing. Now, I think the Biden administration has spent a lot of money on kind of answering mail on the current problem. I don't think we've kind of gotten a handle on the future problem. I think they haven't really figured out what they want to do on mining. I think they have their political base they're worried, quote unquote, they quote to be worried about climate change, but they're also, their base doesn't like mining. So if you are concerned about climate change, like we're going to need a whole lot of metals. We're going to have to I have a piece in the Hill this weekend saying that mining and metals are the new oil. So if you are worried about this stuff, then you ought to you have to decide, you have to pick. If you don't like oil, then you have to go with metals. Decarbonization doesn't mean dematerialization. So we have to pick. And so I would say mining one way or the other, whether it's because of a carbon transition, if it happens, and there's a lot of speed bumps on that road, or because of the fourth industrial revolution, or all the stuff, all the jets we want to produce and missiles and the iPhones and stuff. So if you're a national security person, you better be really freaked out about missile mining. If you care about your iPhone, there's all sorts of funny metals in here. So you need to worry about rare earths, and you need to care about meat and potato earths.
So one of the things that I learned when I was in government, and I'm sure you and many others who are listening in have learned, is there's two sort of parts of any policy. There's the goal, the focus on digital minerals, a pandemic response system, and then there's the process to actually get that accomplished. Now, towards the end of your book, you discuss some structural changes to USAID and the development bureaucracy that you suggest would make our foreign aid system much more streamlined and effective. So, recognizing I've seen some Hill staff names on the call, what, if anything, can Congress do to help empower the development agencies of the executive branch and provide effective guidance, direction, and oversight from the legislature?
So I think if you're in the House right now, I think if you're the House Select Committee on China, I would be encouraging us to hold a series of hearings on things like digital and minerals. I would start and I'd start with that. I would have a conversation about the current system of how hard is it to the current relationship between the executive branch and the legislative branch. That's basically and a lot of the kinds of soft stuff I've talked about have broken down for a bunch of reasons. So I think there could be a series of hearings about looking at specific fixes around something called the Foreign Assistance Act in 1961. There's been one attempt to do it in the mid 80s. There was a partial tweak. Many people on the Hill will say, no, I don't want to do this. But I would just say that there's been sort of accumulated of barnacles that have dealt with that. The second thing is there's a series of what are called congressional directives. So most of what's called the development and diplomacy budget, the 150 account. So many of the folks on this call have heard of the 050 account. If you're a defense person, you've heard of the 050 account. That's the defense budget. The 150 account is diplomacy and development. A lot of the development money is spoken for. They're basically, so if we want to respond to a challenge in the digital world with China, we actually don't have a lot of easy money to play with to respond to that. So a lot of that money is tied up and spoken for. I think we need to kind of I'd like to revisit the system of congressional directives. It's somewhat based on the fact that there's been a breakdown in trust between the executive branch and legislative branch. Maybe we need to have some sort of like Camp David Accords or something on sort of those folks who between the State Department, AID, and the legislature. We need to do something there. I also think there's a series of fixes to how we deliver assistance and how we deliver some of this work. There are some calls in the Biden administration to do what's called localization. Well, in some instances, localization's okay. But I think in some instances, we want to have new entrants that happen to be American companies enter the market, but it's a very segmented market because of all the paperwork and all the rules and stuff you have to follow. So we ought to look at making it easier in something called the federal acquisition rules to make it easier for smaller companies to come in with new innovative ideas in the space. So some of it's about the Foreign Assistance Act, some of it's about procurement rules, some of it's about there are also org chart issues. I've had a very happy career in Washington, largely staying away from org chart discussions, and you'll see that. But I would argue that we have 20 agencies that work on this stuff, on different pieces of this. In the Kennedy administration, he decided to reorganize all of our foreign aid in 1961 because there were 4 agencies, and he said, John F. Kennedy said that was too many. So I would argue with 20 or 21 agencies, that's probably too many. So I think we need to probably, if we believe that we're in an era of great power competition, and that if most of our competition is in the non-military sphere, then we probably need to think about, like, what are we trying to do? What are the kinds of things we want to take on? Then I think we need to say, how are we organized properly to take these on? I would argue that this is the lens. I would argue for the next 30 years, this is the lens we're going to look at our non-military power, is through this lens of great power competition. Certainly Republican administrations and certainly Republican leads and majorities in Congress. I think if they look at this stuff, it's going to be mainly through this lens. It's not going to be through the sustainable development goals. I think there are some people on this call who know what the sustainable development goals are, but I can guarantee you that very few members of Congress know what they are. They're a nice thing. They're not like, there are a lot of people in the Democratic Party kind of like blow them up and make them more important than I think they are. But it's not going to move Republicans to say, well, we've got to hit SDG goal number 7, sub-indicator 123. Like, that's just going to move anybody. There's a sub-universe of people on the left that it does, but what's going to move Republicans is great power competition with China. That's what's going to move. And I think ultimately any kind of reform is going to require a Republican Congress and a Republican president.
So we're going to go to the audience Q&A. We have a few questions that are already lined up here. Just as a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, you can type it into the Q&A box and we will ask it live on air. The first one is from Bernardo Rico, who I had the pleasure of working with. He was formerly at USAID. Now he's director for IRI in Guatemala and Honduras. His is a comment, but I think it's a compelling one and would love your thoughts on it, Dan. So he says, there's no question we need to double down on diplomacy and development in Latin America, where China and even Russia are continual threats. Yet he says, I don't see how we can effectively revert their growing presence and influence without some kind of military threat and potential intervention in Venezuela and even Nicaragua. If we avoided conflict in Venezuela under Trump out of fear of Russia and China's reaction, and Russia goes on to invade Ukraine, I don't see how democracy can be restored in these countries, Venezuela and Nicaragua, with development and diplomacy alone. Do you have a reaction to the role that development can particularly play when it comes to these more crisis nations that are led by dictators like Nicaragua and Venezuela?
Well, thanks, Bernardo. I think it's a really interesting point. I mean, I fall back on what Elliot Abrams said about Venezuela, which is there's 3 solutions to Venezuela. There's magic, negotiations, or a military solution. So I would say, though, I think my concern about let's just take Venezuela for a minute. What I worry about is, I went to Caracas 10 years ago. One of the things that struck me was that a much bigger part of the population than I expected were supporters of Chavez. Now, I think 10 or 11 years later, there's less support for Chavez, but I worry that if you had real free and fair elections in Venezuela, the biggest vote getter would be the Chavez party. That's my worry. And so I also think the problem has been, as you know, both in Nicaragua and Venezuela, the opposition is heavily divided. And so in some ways you could argue that certainly in the case of Venezuela, that Chavez and then Maduro has been a result of sort of the failures of Venezuelan democracy. I think I have a hard time seeing us going the route of, I mean, I think one of the things I ask myself is, like, if I think about many of the folks I know in either of those countries that are in exile, how many of them are, raring to kind of like, march on Caracas or march on Managua? A lot of them are pretty comfortable in Miami. So I have a hard time seeing us lending American troops if I can't see a lot of these elites who are pretty comfortable in exile doing the same thing. So I think, unfortunately, it's hard to see us doing that. Though I understand your thinking about it and your frustration, and it's often crossed my mind too. I'll put it that way.
And I would also say in your book, you speak a lot about not just development, but that it is a co-equal part of these 3Ds, right? So development, diplomacy, and defense. So there is just the argument that these things all work together in unison, rather than one being the definitive solution to all of these different problems. Our next question comes from Emily Hardman Rogers, who's at the State Department. We got into this a little bit, but want to give you another opportunity in case there's something specific. Can you offer a few thoughts on ways that you would streamline U.S. foreign assistance resources? So what she points out is that there's a specific integrity and purpose to each, MCC, DFC, Prosper Africa, USAID, et cetera. How do you kind of streamline those while also recognizing that they're all serving slightly different purposes? Or do you believe that they're all serving different purposes?
So I would argue that that I think these are all look, I think that the MCC was set up 20 years ago. It could have been there's an argument to be had that the MCC could be part of AID. And so one of the reasons I've stayed away from org chart discussions, Emily, is because every solution you put forward generates a lot of antibodies from the various agencies or their supporters. But I would argue that I think that aid ought to have a larger role and a higher level of agency and protagonism in all of this. At the same time, I suspect many people in the Republican Party, I'm in the minority on this view. I held a minority view on this. So I think I think we ought to have a conversation about how we rejigger this. I don't think anyone's going to be fully satisfied. There's no Rubik's Cube solution to the sort of rejiggering the org chart that satisfies everybody. But what I would say is that I think I don't know anybody who would say the current system is satisfactory. I mean, anybody that says, "Oh my gosh, the current arrangement is great." So, but when people suggest alternatives, there's a whole universe of people throw their hands up and say, "Don't do that, don't do that." We did a big exercise in 2017. There was an attempt at the beginning of the Trump administration to review the State Department and AID. Some of it, frankly, was done in kind of a ham-handed, kind of goofy. Some of it was well-intentioned, but some was done in kind of a ham-handed, goofy way. And so there were some people in Washington, many people who didn't like the Trump administration, like, well, it's illegitimate for them to criticize. Or then there were people in the aid committee that kind of got into like a fetal position, or just like they're just being mean. And I took a different tack. I put together a bipartisan commission to say the Trump administration won the election. They have a mandate to review these sorts of things. And if they want to make real change, here's some things. And so we proposed several things. We said there are pieces of PRM, the Population Refugees Bureau, that could be moved to AID. You might look at where MCC sits. Frankly, you'd look at where PEPFAR sits. So I think, one of the reasons, in the case of PEPFAR, my simplistic understanding is that the CDC and HHS people didn't want to be bossed around by the hippies at AID, and the AID people didn't want to be bossed around by the doctors at HHS and CDC. So I think the solution was, well, we'll put this in the State Department. I'm being a little simplistic. And there was also like, well, we need an ambassador rank person. So the other thing was, well, the State Department only cares about if it's an ambassador or this sort of thing. So what I would say is I've put most of my energy in the last 10 years at CSIS looking at what are the things that need to be done. And I start with, let's get agreement on that. And then I would say, then let's have a second. Oftentimes the first conversation is, how do we move the boxes around? You're not saying that, Emily, but I am saying is like, let's come to an agreement, like what needs to be done. And then I'd say, let's have a form follows function discussion.
You call the book, it's really interesting, the American imperative, right? And imperative is a very, very strong and compelling word. Can you kind of paint a picture for if we don't reinvest in the sort of development architecture as you're describing over the next five or 10 years, what does the world that we will be living in look like?
So I think several things will happen. I think one is if we kind of are asleep at the switch on this multilateral stuff, we're going to have China creeping into kind of bigger and larger, influence in the multilateral system. If they want to run the Tiddlywinks Association or the Backgammon Association, like I'm fine with that, but I don't want them to run the IMF or the World Bank or being Secretary General of the UN. We need to protect the commanding heights of the multilateral system. So some of it's about we're just going to kind of creep up in their influence. If we're asleep at the switch, that's a problem. A second one is if we're not clever about kind of international education and training, future CEOs of developing country businesses, future prime ministers, future health ministers, future ag ministers, they're all going to have Beijing on their speed dial when they become prime minister or CEO, as opposed to Boston on their speed dial when they become prime minister or CEO. We're not going to like that. If they get control of all this digital stuff, that means that China's going to have an enormous ability to vacuum up a whole bunch of data. It's going to enable bad actors in developing countries to censor people. And it's also going to enable them to give Chinese companies kind of first dibs in terms of e-commerce and other opportunities. So we don't want the digital rails of the future controlled by China. We also, I think, have to probably go and revisit some of our trading arrangements. I would argue all of our trade deals up until now have not been based on trade, but on geopolitical decisions have been a big piece of it. And so I would argue that at some point we're going to have to revisit, are we happy with it? One of the reasons we have a hard time getting people to follow us right now is a lot of countries different than 10 years ago is, hey, you want me to pick a side? And guess what? China's my #1 trading partner and you're bossing me around and telling me to do X or Y. We want to get people to not have China be their #1 trading partner, but we can't just tell them, don't have China be your #1 trading partner. We have to either kind of show up, have trade agreements with countries. I would argue we probably have to revisit some of the things that some of the trading arrangements we've looked at in the past. And so I think we're going to have to look at trade in a different way, I would argue, and that's maybe a more difficult conversation. I would also say that we're not going to like a world where rule of law is a lot weaker, where if you care about religious freedom or political liberty, like if they're kind of running the show and setting the rules, they're going to have their finger on the scale of anti-religious freedom. They're going to have their finger on the scale of not having freedom of speech and freedom of association. They're going to have their finger on the scale of inserting in themselves, having people insert themselves into your most personal decisions, like how many kids you're going to have. They really big on that one child policy, if you'll recall. They're going to have their finger on the scale of not having rule of law, but like corruption as like not an exception or something that we should think is a bad thing. People are going to say, oh, corruption, that's kind of like just how things get done. So I think, all the pushback against corruption will fall to the wayside. So what we'll find is that over time, a lot of our friends and allies will have said to them, we want you to choose, but because China and Russia have filled these voids because we don't do enough, that we're going to find that over time, it's harder and harder for our friends to help us sustain a system that we've had and we've benefited from for the last 80 years. The current system has got its problems and it's weaker than it used to be, but we should want people to sign up to our system, the currently led by the United States and the West, not some other goofy system, the kind of system I just described.
It's such an important point because the country with the most dominant influence in the world is going to determine the preferences, the business practices, the lifestyles of people in every country around the world. And to date, it has, thankfully, because of many men and women who worked very, very hard in building out this system, has supported the way of life that we've all had the opportunity to experience. A question about the allies that we have. So do you see any allies to the United States that are using their development in a particularly effective way?
So, I think Japan, and in particular, is a country that I have a lot of respect for. They take a very long-term view of their partnerships with countries. Now, sometimes I'm going to call it like, I'm not going to say it's amorally pragmatic, but I would say we have more of a finger on the scale of kind of democracy and human rights at times. So like if China has to say, am I getting out of Myanmar or not? Sometimes they'll say, well, maybe I'll stay a little bit longer in the hopes of supporting things because they have their interests are slightly different than ours. But what I would say is they take a long-term training view of how they partner with countries, and they get people who become their lifelong friends in their whole career. Think about Japan as a great place to do business and as a reference point. And so I think Japan's a good example. They do some things really well. I also think that if I think about, some of the international agencies. I think, for example, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, EBRD, which was set up as a post-Cold War institution, is doing a really good job in Ukraine. They've been really forward-leaning and doing some really great stuff on Ukraine. So I think the multilateral system isn't all bad. And I'd say that EBRD is an example of somebody who's doing some really good stuff in Ukraine. So I'd say Japan in terms of somebody to look at. And then if you looked at, say, well, who's really acquitting themselves in this Ukraine thing, the EBRD is an example of that.
I think this is probably going to be the last question that we have, but everything that you've described, as we've talked about, there is a very sort of bipartisan component to this, both in the need and the urgency of using development more effectively, and also the tools that we can use. We've spoken a little bit about the vocabulary and how that's a challenge. I'm struck by recent research and polling that has indicated that the partisanship in the United States is becoming increasingly more dominant, and that upwards of 80% essentially of both Democrats and Republicans believe that the other party is intentionally trying to destroy the country. So in the context of such a hyper-partisan environment, how can we build up support for development as a core need of American foreign policy without without undermining it with the other party? How do we make it palatable for both parties at the same time?
So I think a lot of the problem has been in the Republican Party recently. And I would say that we have I think that development and diplomacy are really important. If you care about, if you are worried about great power competition with China, then you need to worry about that. And if you follow that we're in a great power competition, ultimately, this great power competition is going to play out in these developing countries and in a non-military way. So you need to care about it. I think the most of the Democrats are kind of already there in many ways. I think they have some woolly-headed notions about some of it that turns off Republicans. I think some of those woolly-headed notions make it as such that, well, why do I want to like this stuff if they like it, and they have these woolly-headed notions. So I think we need to be a little bit more hard-headed about it. But I think at the same time, we need to, and so we just need to understand that if we're going to push back against China, it's going to be not just with ATACMS and F-35s, which I'm all for that stuff, and a 500-ship Navy, I'm all for that, that we're going to need to take on a series of other fronts, if you will, if we're ultimately going to defeat China and Russia.
Well, Dan, thank you so much. Just as a reminder to everybody, the book is called The American Imperative. It is available wherever books are sold. And Dan, thank you so much for one, writing this incredible book. I would say that it is imperative to read it, and for foreign policy experts to begin applying it, particularly those in government. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to everybody for listening in and participating.
Thanks, Carrie. Thanks to the Vandenberg Coalition. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye.